It is Wednesday, October 28th, 2015. I am Doug Neill, and this is Verbal to Visual Video. We are now ready for part 3 of this week's series on using your visual thinking skills to design a curriculum. After yesterday's video on using the clothesline method and maybe a big wall to get a sequence of learning activities down, brainstorming what that exactly will look like, today we are ready to actually produce the learning materials. Let's get into it. Now, before we actually start building our course materials, we're gonna bring in another of my favorite visual tools, a thing called the empathy map. Here's what that looks like. What you start with is a drawn profile of a person's head, and you don't have to worry about it being too realistic here. And this person is going to represent your student, a member of the audience that you are trying to reach with the curriculum that you are designing. Then around that person's head, you break it up into sections. And those sections represent what that person is thinking, what that person is seeing, what they are saying, what they are feeling, and what they are hearing. And your task is to fill each of those sections with what your student or your students are actually thinking. What's going on inside their head? What are they seeing? What's their experience like? What things are they saying? And what things are they feeling and hearing from others? That visual tool is called the empathy map for a good reason, because it allows you to have empathy for someone else. You're able to get into someone else's experience and try to see the world from their point of view. And in this case, since we are designing a set of learning activities that we hope resonates with a particular audience, it's important to have that understanding, be able to tap into the perspective of the people that we are building our thing for. And to be able to fill out those different sections of the empathy map, you need to know your students well, which goes back to part 1 of this series, where your task was to define and understand your audience, which is, I think, an important role of any teacher, is paying just as much attention as to what's going on in your students' lives, or at least understanding what their life is like. That is just as important as the things, the ideas that you want to share. And this empathy map shows you whether or not you actually know your students, and then helps you to build something useful for them. Once you have filled out an empathy map representing your typical student's experience in the world, then you're ready to start building the course materials. This is where you will be producing the lesson plans, or designing the interactive notebooks that you're going to use in class, or recording the videos that are going to make up your online course, brainstorming the discussion questions that you'll ask at the end of each unit. This is when you will actually fill the container that we mentioned in part 1. It's in this stage of building the course materials where the work you have done in the previous 2 parts are really going to come in handy, because these 2 pieces here, the initial brainstorming, the initial planning that you did, along with this big brainstorm of what the specific sequence of learning activities will look like, these 2 pieces are your compass. They're a little bit of a roadmap. They're your rough draft. They're the thing that you can turn to as you're producing that material to keep you on track and to make sure that you keep both the big picture in mind and work with the details that you already have brainstormed. And I think that the visual nature of the way you did that initial planning will make it much easier to reference all of that information when you get down to building your course materials. I also want to mention 3 tips that I think are worth keeping in mind when you're actually building the things that your students will use. Tip number 1, be explicit from the very beginning about the transformation that you want your students to undergo. When you introduce that transformation up front, it gives your students a context for everything that comes after that. It helps them to understand why they are being asked to engage in whatever activities you're encouraging them to engage in. Tip number 2, try to keep a consistent format with the materials that you're creating. Whatever structure you build into each unit and whatever way in which you are sharing ideas, make sure that you're not jumping around between too many different things. You want your students to come to know what to expect from each chunk of the learning materials that you're putting out. That's not to say that it's not worth adding in a little bit of spontaneity and new things that might throw your students off a little bit. That's also a potentially useful learning activity. But for, I would say, the majority of the learning activities, it's worthwhile having a consistent structure, consistent format to those individual chunks. And finally, tip number 3, contextualize each step along the way. As you move from one unit to the next or one learning activity to the next, do a little bit of setup so that when a student engages with that activity, they're reminded of what they've done, and then while they're doing it or after they've done it, also point to what comes next, so that at any given moment throughout this learning experience, they understand where they are, and they also can see where they've been and where they're going, how the current activity fits into the overall transformation that you are helping them to take on. To give some examples of those 3 tips, the transformation that I try to lay out up front within the verbal to visual classroom is that my goal is for you to achieve these 2 pieces right here. That you'll leave the classroom with a solid foundation of core skills and a customized visual note-taking process that fits your circumstances and your goals. That's the transformation, and I allude to that transformation at various times throughout the course. The format for me was video lessons, somewhat similar to these, followed up with activities, worksheets, prompts, guides, something that you as the student would engage in after watching an instructional module like this. So for me, that back and forth between fairly short video lesson and then an activity to go engage in and learn from and reflect on. That's the format that I tried to keep throughout all of the modules of the Verbal to Visual introductory course. And finally, to contextualize each step, what I would often do at the beginning of those videos, very similar to what I did at the beginning of this one, is refer back to what we did last time. What we did in this case in part 2 of this video series. And then, as you'll see very soon, I'm gonna mention what's coming tomorrow so that the things that go on now, you understand where we're coming from and you'll have a sense of where we're going. So your task now is to complete these 2 steps. Create an empathy map for your typical student to get a sense of where they are, and keep that empathy map in mind while you are building out your course materials, while keeping these 3 tips in mind as well. Then be sure to come back tomorrow where we will talk about what to do after you have put that curriculum into practice. We're going to talk about iterating on a course design, curriculum design over time. I'm excited about that. I will see you then. Good luck.